Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 31st, 1865, actually it's February 1st, 1865, the 13th Amendment passes the House just barely above the necessary 2/3 majority needed for ratification, and after it passes the House, it is sent to the states to become an amendment. This moment, folks, it may not be the most esoteric. It is one of the most famous amendments. In fact, this moment is the culminating moment in the film Lincoln. It's portrayed as Abraham Lincoln's crowning achievement, the end of slavery and the freeing of enslaved African Americans. But anytime Hollywood gets its hand on a story, you can rest assured that there is a lot that is not in the picture. So I think that's kind of how we're going to frame today's episode. Some things you may not know about the 13th Amendment, and here to convince you and me that there is indeed esoterica around this amendment is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hi, how are you?
All right. So, Kellie, want to start here? What do you think is kind of the biggest thing that we need to correct in terms of people's understanding of this amendment?
Yeah, I like to tell people that the 13th Amendment is sort of the coroner's report. It's the official time of death of slavery. But really, slavery dies much earlier with the Emancipation Proclamation. I think if there was ever a film to be made, it would be on the Emancipation Proclamation that frees about 3 million of the 4 million people enslaved. So by the time you get to the 13th Amendment, a majority of the enslaved African Americans living in the United States have already been freed by Union troops and the Emancipation Proclamation or through their own determination and grit to leave their plantations.
So why so much focus, why a film about the 13th and not a film about the Emancipation Proclamation?
That's a really good question. I remember Eric Foner, my advisor and professor at beloved and famed professor at Columbia University, talked about this same thing as well, that Steven Spielberg should have focused on the Emancipation Proclamation. I think that there's a lot of, artistic license used when we talk about the 13th Amendment, but there's also a lot of controversy about the 13th Amendment as well. I don't think people realize that it took a long time for some of these states to actually ratify the amendment, to make it official, and that some of the states that struggled to ratify it were states that were actually still a part of the Union. So when we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, it freed slaves in the states of those that had seceded to the Confederacy. But when we think about border states like Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, these are states that remained in the North and still had their slaves.
And I would also add, in addition to the inherent drama of vote counting, which was the backbone of the movie Lincoln, there was also Lincoln himself and his hesitance to amend the Constitution. I think it's easy in this day and age, when we're used to the Constitution being amended and updated on a pretty regular basis, that in the 1860s, the Constitution hadn't been touched since 1804. And Lincoln himself considered it kind of a perfect sacred document and had to be brought to the table in order to amend it, and he wanted to use these other tools like the Emancipation Proclamation to get the job done.
In a lot of ways, I think Lincoln saw the Emancipation Proclamation as an act of war or a tool of war, but he didn't think that a 13th Amendment was necessary to bring about the eradication of slavery itself.
And in fact, the end of slavery, it wasn't just the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. There had been a gradual move toward abolition that was happening in between the two. So you talked, Kellie, about the way that the states that were still in revolt against the Union were the ones that were covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. That actually exempted Tennessee, which had seceded, but was now under Union control. It was actually being run by Andrew Johnson. And Johnson, he stops being an enslaver himself in 1863, and then he frees all of the enslaved people in Tennessee in 1864. And so for somebody like Lincoln and others who were probably anticipating some sort of gradual emancipation, those were signs that this was going to continue to happen. I think it's the resistance that Kellie points to in these states like Kentucky and Delaware that pointed to what the real roadblocks were.
I mean, Kentucky's particularly interesting here. And it's funny because you think, I mean, I like your way of putting it, Kellie, of this being a coroner's report or this being some sort of final proclamation, to use that word. But nevertheless, it didn't seem like it was sweeping and clean and, applicable all over the place. There were still lots to hash out state by state, including, I think, Kentucky in this really sort of fascinating way.
Yeah, Kentucky is like, hold on, wait a second. We didn't leave. We want our slaves. And, I think part of that is that Lincoln tried to make a deal with them as well and say, okay, we will compensate you for your slaves. We'll, in fact, pay you $400 per slave. And Kentucky was like, no, we don't want that. And I think part of that is because they understood that their enslaved labor was worth more than that, but also because they were unwilling to relinquish their enslaved labor. And this actually happens in the American Revolution as well. George Washington tries to compensate South Carolina and Georgia to allow their enslaved men to fight for the revolution. And South Carolina and Georgia are like, no, we don't want any buyouts.
I have to say, when I read that, it just struck me as it's reparations for slave owners.
Yes, yes.
That, like the one time we've seemingly had a really concrete conversation about the economic impact it's been to compensate slave owners. I mean, it's just unreal.
And that's not just like in America, like in the British West Indies, the UK gives 20 million pounds to former slaveholders to compensate them for the loss of their labor. So reparations has definitely happened, but just for slave owners.
And this fight that's been happening in Kentucky, it actually makes Kentuckians more sympathetic to the Confederacy. Obviously, they never secede, but there's this saying about Kentucky that it's the first state to join the Confederacy after the war. And there is this real sympathy for the Confederacy between 1867 and 1894, so those crucial decades after the war. Kentucky elects 6 governors who had either been Confederates or Confederate sympathizers. So they were kind of all in on the cause after it had been lost.
And Kentucky also delays ratifying the 13th Amendment. It's actually not until 1976. This is almost 100 years later when State Representative May Street Kidd basically said, no, this is not going to stand. And she files a resolution to ratify the 13th Amendment.
I really like this notion of Kentucky being the first state to join the Confederacy after the war. But why didn't Kentucky just sort of realize who it was and secede?
Well, because secession was about slavery, but it was also about an understanding of your relationship to the Union. So Kentucky believed that it could both remain part of the Union and continue to be a place that enslaved people. And it was right for a really long time about that, right? It's right until the 13th Amendment is enacted. So they thought they were going to be able to thread the needle like these other border states did, that we can have it both ways. We can be loyal to the United States, and we can also enslave human beings.
Right. I mean, it really complicates this notion of the sort of clean line around a very simple question. And, we talked about it, I guess, in a recent episode, too, about when they added territories and added states, they kind of had to just rehash this question, so it's almost like the slavery question is really actually just asked over and over and over, state by state, really.
And in many ways, that's why you need the 13th Amendment as this, I love that, Kellie, coroner's report, because otherwise you were going to continue to have this same debate over and over and over again, not just in Kentucky and Delaware and Missouri, but you were going to have it in all of the new territories that you brought into the country. It had to just end. Like, we fought a war.
Yeah. So we've talked about the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th. We've talked a little bit about the various states that were stuck in maybe a middle ground. Another thing on our list of things maybe people don't know about the 13th Amendment, Niki, there's some controversy about Lincoln's signature upon ratification.
Yeah, look, Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment. And I get why. Like, he fought really hard for it. He wanted some ownership of it. But presidents don't actually sign amendments. So they actually had to pass a follow-up resolution just to make clear that, like, presidents don't sign these things. That he can sign it, but that signature is meaningless. Just to make clear that he wasn't setting a precedent of presidents needing to sign off on amending the Constitution.
That's amazing, and it makes me think, obviously, of Donald Trump's, real like desire to just put his signature on absolutely anything that crosses in front of him. And maybe Lincoln had a little bit of that in front of him too. And that's just because the actual thing that codifies an amendment is that it gets ratified by the states, and so it's not a bill, and so it's not really the president who's making it happen.
Right. The only part of the federal government that has a role here is Congress, right? Both houses of Congress need to pass it, and then it goes out to the states. But there's not really a role for the president in all of that. Poor Lincoln.
I do respect that desire to put your signature on it. So one other thing I think we should discuss, that's getting maybe a little more attention now. People think of this 13th Amendment, rightfully so, as about slavery, and it's very short. I mean, if you read it, it's pretty efficient language. But in that language, there is a lot, and some stuff that was added that has really had a long legacy. And so, Kellie, you want to talk a little bit about this, indentured servitude part of it?
So radical Republican Charles Sumner is really trying to push absolute equality before the law, carte blanche. Slavery should be abolished. But there is this little asterisk, if you will, within the 13th Amendment that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude is, allowed, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So basically it's saying, slavery is abolished unless you commit a crime, then you can go to jail or you can go to prison, and that is a form of enslavement that would still be considered acceptable. And so what it does is it opens up the door for states to find a loophole in which they can enslave or maintain slavery through the criminal justice system.
Right, and that it's not just that you're locked up, but you can be put to work. So convict labor and the use of prison labor, of inmate labor, becomes a huge thing in the South, particularly in the South, but actually elsewhere in the United States too, because that was the compromise that needed to be made.
And we should say that there's a fantastic documentary called 13th that is about this loophole, as you put it. But, one thing I'm curious about, Kellie, is, did the people who wrote this and argued for this clause realize what leaving this door open would mean? We think of the prison industrial complex as something that started maybe in the 80s, in the 1980s, but really this feels like the opening of that. But did they realize that's what was really at stake?
Yeah. I don't think anyone could have predicted the way that mass incarceration looks today. I don't think that was the intention behind it. But certainly by 1890, Black people are 10% of the population and about 30% of the prison population. So it definitely did not take long for them to realize that they could exploit this loophole and create what mass incarceration is today.
Yeah, it's this long evolution, right? You have convict labor in the late 19th century and the development of what was called slavery by another name in the book that Doug Blackman wrote about this, that develops over time into the system we have now. But I think that the genius of a lot of the work that's been done on mass incarceration in the past decade has been to connect all of those dots from that moment in the 13th Amendment through mass incarceration today.
We're going to start to wrap up there, but Kellie, any final tidbits, things people may not realize about the 13th Amendment you want to sneak in?
So the state of Mississippi basically takes until 1995 to ratify the 13th Amendment. That's insane. But then after they finally decide to ratify the 13th Amendment, they forgot to send in the paperwork. So apparently,
the air quotes are flying on this podcast.
Apparently you have to file your ratification with the National Archives, and they never submitted that paperwork. When they finally did, it was 2013, the year that Steven Spielberg's Lincoln film came out. 2013. So that, the irony is that we're still talking about this moment, and that it's still relevant.
And there are a number of states that haven't ratified it. I think most of those are states that didn't exist at the time, though part of me just feels like it's a good PR stunt to just go out of your way to, I don't even know if that's allowed, but just go out of your way to ratify the 13th Amendment. Like,
what does it cost?
You get an article on Yahoo News out of it, and you can move on or whatever. But anyway, all right, we're gonna leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And thanks to you, Kellie Carter-Jackson.
Thank you.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at thisdaypod.com. On that site, you can also read bios for all of us who work on the show, and you can also leave us a message if you have any questions or comments or ideas for future topics. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.
From